In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro delves into the political landscape surrounding Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and the broader implications of their policies. The discussion is marked by a critical examination of Harris's campaign strategies, economic policies, and the overarching narrative of joy that her administration attempts to project. The podcast opens with a provocative assertion that Republicans are akin to Nazis, suggesting a deep-seated connection between contemporary political factions and historical atrocities. Shapiro reflects on their own journey of understanding race and racism, questioning whether their past indifference to racial issues makes them complicit. This personal introspection sets the stage for a broader critique of the political environment, particularly focusing on Kamala Harris's candidacy. Shapiro provocatively suggests renaming the George Washington Monument to honor George Floyd, emphasizing the pervasive nature of racism in American society. This discussion serves as a backdrop for analyzing Harris's political identity and her attempts to navigate the complexities of race in her campaign. The podcast highlights Harris's campaign strategy, which is characterized by a lack of substantive policy discussions. Shapiro notes that Harris has managed to avoid answering adversarial questions for an extended period, focusing instead on themes of free money and joy. This approach is seen as a deliberate attempt to minimize scrutiny of her positions, particularly regarding economic policies that critics label as communism light. Shapiro critiques Harris's commitment to only 2 presidential debates, arguing that this is a tactic to shield her from public exposure. The fear is that her positions, which are often viewed as weak or ineffective, will be laid bare in a debate setting. The discussion underscores the notion that the less the public sees of Harris, the more favorable their perception may be, a strategy that the campaign seems to be banking on. A significant portion of the podcast is dedicated to Harris's economic policies, particularly her recent proposals aimed at addressing inflation and rising costs. Shapiro draws parallels between Harris's plans and those of authoritarian regimes, labeling her approach as reminiscent of the Maduro plan from Venezuela. The critique centers on her proposed price controls, which Shapiro argues are fundamentally flawed and historically ineffective. The discussion emphasizes that price controls do not address the root causes of inflation and often lead to unintended consequences, such as shortages and economic stagnation. Shapiro points out that the Biden-Harris administration's economic record has been marked by soaring inflation and rising mortgage rates, which have tripled since they took office. This economic backdrop serves as a critical lens through which to view Harris's proposals, which are seen as superficial solutions to complex problems. A recurring theme in the podcast is the concept of joy that Harris's campaign seeks to project. Shapiro argues that this narrative is a facade, masking the underlying failures of the administration's policies. The discussion draws parallels between Harris's emphasis on joy and historical totalitarian regimes that used similar tactics to distract from their oppressive policies. Shapiro references Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, suggesting that the promotion of joy in political discourse often serves to suppress dissent and critical thought. The implication is that Harris's campaign is attempting to create a culture of compliance, where questioning policies or expressing dissatisfaction is seen as a violation of the collective joy. The podcast also critiques the media's role in shaping public perception of Harris and Biden. Shapiro notes that the media often downplays the administration's failures while amplifying narratives of joy and progress. This dynamic creates a disconnect between the reality of the economic situation and the optimistic portrayals presented to the public. Shapiro highlights a recent incident involving Nancy Mace, who faced backlash for mispronouncing Kamala Harris's name. This incident is framed as an example of how the media and political allies are quick to label dissenters as disrespectful or racist, further entrenching the narrative that any criticism of Harris is rooted in prejudice. As the podcast draws to a close, Shapiro reflects on the implications of Harris's campaign strategies and economic policies for the future of American politics. The discussion suggests that the administration's reliance on superficial narratives of joy and free money may ultimately backfire, as voters become increasingly aware of the economic realities they face. Shapiro concludes with a call to action, urging listeners to remain vigilant and critical of the narratives being presented by political leaders. The overarching message is one of skepticism towards the promises of joy and prosperity that often accompany political campaigns, particularly those that lack substantive policy discussions. Shapiro emphasizes that true progress requires more than just a facade of happiness. It necessitates accountability, transparency, and a commitment to addressing the real issues facing the nation.